All right. In this video, we're going to be talking about the Mendix domain model, what it is, and how to configure it. We're also going to touch on entities and the way to get all those set up so that you can start working in your project. So let's just jump right into it. If you just double click here in the main module on the domain model, it'll pop right up with this window right here. And so what we're going to do, what I'm going to do first is just briefly introduce what the domain model is. Really simply put, it's just a visual representation of your database where you're storing all your data for your project. And every project needs a domain model because if you're storing any sort of data, which almost every project does, then you're going to need a way to tell Mendix how you want to store it. So to store your data, you're going to need to create entities. And an entity is just so Mendix knows how and what types of data should be stored. So for example, in this project, we have a Rate My BYU Professor project. Maybe just think for a second, what types of data are we going to need to store? One that I thought of that we'll definitely need is professors. We're going to need to store the names and other information about professors so that students can go on and rate these professors. So we're going to need to create a professor entity. So let's go ahead and do that. So there we go. You just clicked this little E up here in the top left corner and drag out, and there's our first entity in the database, or the domain model, I should say. And then let's name it professor. And then, so for each entity that you create, you need to tell Mendix what types of data you want to associate with that entity and what types of data you want to store about the professor. And so to do that, you come down to this attributes tab right here and click new, and we're going to create some different attributes that are associated with professors. So one that we'll definitely need is a name. And for each attribute, you need to assign it a type. And so you'll see right here, there's this type dropdown, and you'll see in this dropdown, there's a lot of different options. For this one, we just are going to use string, because string, as it says right here in this description, is just text. It can contain letters, spaces, numbers, and other characters, but we would just want to store it as text. So that's what we're going to do here. So click OK. There's our first attribute. Something else that we'll probably need to store along with the professor entity is maybe the department that they're working in. It's kind of optional, but that might be a helpful thing to store as well. And that's also just text. So we'll click OK. Maybe something else that would be useful to store is how long the professor's been working, how many years. And this is maybe something we could just call began teaching at. And you'll see right here, Mendix infers that the type of this attribute is not text, it's date and time, which is correct. We want to store this as a date and a time of when they began teaching at. And I think that for now, that's probably good. One last thing I'll mention briefly. For each entity that you create, it's a good idea to also give it an ID. An ID is just a way for the database to more efficiently store data and be able to pull the data that you want faster. Because otherwise, how would Mendix know, maybe there's two entity objects that have the same name and department and the same date that they both began teaching. And so how would Mendix know how to differentiate between those two professors? So that's why we need an ID, so that we can always know that each one of these entity objects is unique when we create them. So let's just call this professor ID. And you'll see the type here is an auto number. That's good. That just means that Mendix will take care of the number for us. We don't have to manually go in and set the ID number every time. So that looks pretty good. I just moved it up to the top, and there we go. So there's our first entity. Now maybe think for a second, in a Rate My Professor app, what other types of entities might we need? Another one that we might need is a rating or like a review entity. because for each professor, we're going to be assigning them reviews that students can leave for them. And so we need a way to store the review data or the rating data. So maybe we can just call this one a rating entity. We can revisit the names later, but so same thing. Let's first give it an ID, rating ID, auto number. That's great. We'll also need to store the actual number, like the rating number that a student gave for the rating. So I'll just call that a rating number here. And you'll see here, the type here is an integer. And a value of type integer is just a positive or negative number without decimals. So that sounds pretty good. If you ever don't know what type to assign something, then you can just click through some of these and they have the description right below it, which is really helpful. So there's the rating number. And then maybe one last thing, I don't know if we need this, but we can just make it for now, is maybe like a description, because maybe someone wants to leave like a comment along with a rating. So that could be helpful, and that's just text. So that's good. And there we go. So that's a good way to create a rating entity. Perfect. Okay, the last thing I think we might need for this is a course entity. Like for each class that a professor teaches, we might want to associate the professors with the classes that they teach and the department that it's in. So let's create a course entity. And for this entity, same thing, we're going to need an ID, a course ID. We'll probably also want to have the department, just like for a professor, maybe the department that the class is in. That could be a string. One other thing we might want is like the course number, like MSB 341. And that probably is still a string just because it has letters and numbers. And I think that that looks pretty good. So there we go. There's 3 entities that we've just created, but we still have one more problem. As of right now, these 3 entities are not related to each other. Mendix won't know that these 3 entities have any sort of relationship. They're just kind of floating in the database. They don't know that they should be related to each other. So in order to associate these entities with each other, we need to create some associations. Associations are just how a domain model knows that these Mendix, or that these entities in Mendix have a relationship. So how do we do that? Well, you can do it in one of 2 ways. The first way, probably the easiest way, is just from dragging from the side of an entity. You can just drag an arrow like this, and you'll see it creates this arrow right here. And that just means that now these 2 entities have a relationship. And so what does this mean? I'll break this down for you. This arrow right here is just a way of notating that multiple ratings, this little star asterisk right here just means multiple rating entities can be associated with one professor, which is what we want, because a professor could have multiple reviews left about them. And so that looks good. And so same thing here, I think courses, we could do the same thing, drag from course to professor, because a professor could teach multiple different courses, right? So I think that this logic makes sense. And so now professor and course are related, and rating and professor are related. And the last relationship is rating to course. And I think for this, it would also be multiple ratings could be associated with one course, because I think, well, we might change this later, but as I think about it, you could also rate a course that a professor's teaching. And so multiple ratings could be associated with one course, and multiple courses could be associated with one professor. So I think that that is our simple domain model right now. And so that's one way you can create associations. Another way is if you double click into the entity, and you'll see that there's different tabs up here. One of them is associations. And so now you'll see that if we look under the professor, you'll see that both of these associations are now showing up in the associations tab. And that's helpful if you want to have another way to edit it. The rest of these tabs we might revisit at a later video, but for now, I think that's what you need to know about domain models and entities. So in the next video, we'll be setting up more of the layout of our app. We'll add a couple extra pages and add some navigation, and we'll go from there.